And a very warm welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Head. I'm the BBC correspondent here. I'm also the Vice President of the Correspondents Club. And welcome to the latest in the series of distinguished speakers we've had coming, organised for us by the International Peace Foundation's Bridges for Peace series, where they brought a number of some of the world's greatest advocates of peace here to Bangkok to hear their thoughts on the promotion of peace and the avoidance of conflict. And tonight we're very privileged to have one of the most outstanding civil rights activists in the United States in recent years, activist for African Americans, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Before I start with a proper introduction, I'm going to invite Uwe Morawetz to come up and give us an outline of what the Peace Foundation is doing with this series and a little bit about tonight's program, and then I will take over from him. Uwe.
So, welcome to the second ASEAN event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, which is a non-political and non-religious foundation, under the patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. Since November last year, 70 Bridges events have been continuously held in Thailand and Malaysia, involving the participation of Nobel laureates from all fields as well as other keynote speakers. The events aimed to support education have been hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including some of the country's major universities and think tanks. The second ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, which was, in the year 2000, initiated by the UN General Assembly. It follows a series of 300 Bridges events, which we have already hosted in Thailand and the Philippines since 2003. 35 Nobel laureates, as well as 13 other keynote speakers and artists participated in the events, reaching an audience of 120,000 participants to date. The aim of Bridges is to facilitate and strengthen dialogue and communication between societies in Southeast Asia, with their multiple cultures and faiths, as well as with peoples in other parts of the world, to promote understanding and trust. The events aim at building bridges with local universities and other institutions in Southeast Asia to establish long-term relationships with Nobel laureates, experts and decision makers, which may result in common research programs or other forms of collaboration. Many of the Nobel laureates who have visited Thailand over the last years now are invited back by the universities. They start research programs with the universities. Some of them stay for up to 3 months. And also Thai students get invited by these Nobel laureates to work in the labs abroad. By enhancing science, technology, and education as a basis for peace and development, the events may lead to a better cooperation for the advancement of peace, freedom, and security in the region, with the active involvement of the young generation, ASEAN's key to the future. This is why Bridges has not been designed as a one-time event, but as a continuing process of synergies over several years to make the series of events a sustainable success for Thailand, for Malaysia, and for Southeast Asia as a whole. I'm grateful to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, a long-time partner, as well as to our sponsors who have enabled to make the idea of Bridges a reality. I would like to say thank you to everyone present today for taking part in this program. May it help us to facilitate a new culture of peace through dialogue, transcending its definition as merely the absence of war or armed conflict, into a new understanding what the basis for peace is: education. In this spirit, we welcome today the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who's agreed to come to Thailand after 6 years again to support the events. We look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Thank you.
I won't waste too much time introducing a man who must be very well known to all of you here as one of the most outstanding advocates of civil rights in the United States, and the man who in many ways paved the way for the remarkable events we witnessed this year. The first African-American president of the United States, Barack Obama. In many ways that path was first trodden by the Reverend Jesse Jackson with his pioneering campaigns for the presidential nomination, and indeed to raise the passion of voters back in the 1980s. The Reverend Jesse Jackson has actually asked to speak, I think, from the podium here, so he will come up now if you'd like to come and introduce yourself, sir, and I'll leave it at that. When it comes to taking questions, I'll sit over here.
Good evening. Good evening. Is it good morning? Right. It's a joy to be with you again in this place. I look forward to sharing with you tonight for some time. I do want to introduce traveling with us on our mission to Malaysia and now back to Thailand, an outstanding advocate for peace and justice, Prince Albert from Lincoln. Please, Lincolnshire. I do have 4 members of our last visit here to kick off this event with Prince Albert from Liechtenstein. At that time, just 6 short years ago, I remember being with Father Joe at the Mercy Center. Who are you, Father Joe? Stand again. Give him a hand, please. Then we traveled to Chiang Mai, the Mae Sot, to see such abounding poverty, which remains a central theme for us here tonight and for the world these years later. In some sense, I come tonight as an American with a sense of joy and head held a little higher because of the election results last year with the election of President Barack Hussein Obama as America's 44th president. Part of what makes it exciting is that we now have a presidential leader who has a new worldview. We had the last 8 years one who saw the world through a keyhole and not through a door, and could not appreciate the impact of global politics. We say at home too much, all politics are local. Reality is all politics are global, and those who would dare be world leaders must have a worldview driven by a body of world experience. It became even clearer to me today as I thought about and asked about the contrast between President Bush and President Barack Obama, is that to grow up in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, to have classmates who are Muslims and Buddhists and Christians and Jews in a multiracial, multicultural environment, to have some sense of the growth of Southeast Asia as a growing lion, not just as a Asian tiger. And then to spend time furthermore in Hawaii, to have an African father from Kenya, brilliant man, a mother from Kansas and on to Columbia and New York and Harvard, gives one a sense of global consciousness, and contrast that with growing up in Odessa, Texas. One's difference between Odessa, Texas and Southeast Asia and what it means to the world today, and Hawaii and Kansas and New York and in Boston. When we determined we were coming, and it was reported I was going to Malaysia, a friend called and said, now, of all the things you can do, why are you going to Malaysia? That's where you know that TV you're watching, that plasma TV screen. Yes, that's Malaysia. That cell phone you're talking on, that's Malaysia. That laptop that you got, that's Malaysia. Those microchips you have, that's Malaysia. And so it seems that that lack of appreciation of just how globalized our world is, it haunts us at this stage in our history. 2/3 of laptops are made in Taiwan. Number one exporter of microchips. The U.S. is Malaysia. China holds the U.S. Debt. Toyota is sweeping the automotive market. Much of the electronic infrastructure is coming from Southeast Asia. As we look at the world through a door and not through a keyhole, and leaders who must see the globe and not just the local map, half of all human beings are Asian, and half of them are Chinese. 1 billion people plus in India, twice more than the U.S. and the Russian republics combined. 1/8 of the human race is African, 1/4 Nigerian. In our own hemisphere, 2/3 of our hemisphere speaks Spanish. English is a minority language in our hemisphere. When the president of the Russian republics, Mr. Putin, as it were, and Mr. Barack meet, that's about 1/8 of the human race. That is a minority meeting. And there will not be many more meetings in our lifetime, but 1/8 decides what the other 7/8 are going to do. Perhaps that's why we should have had a G200 meeting, not just a G20 meeting. Because when the G20 met, and they wanted their messages streamed around the world, it came from Southeast Asia. They wanted people to watch them on plasma TV around the world, or the laptops that did not come basic from the G20, but the world for too long has been locked out. It is glorious to see our transitional development from being in this part of the world at war, in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, to move from warring adversaries to trading partners is a great step in the right direction. With it are certain internal challenges that can be resolved around a battlefield and not around a bargaining table and not around a battlefield. The irony is that the U.S. opted for, after World War II, opted for military superiority. And thus our research and development is focused in that way. We make the best in the world of what nobody wants. We make the best F-16s and the most smart bombs and the strongest nuclear stockpile, but there's no market for it. We would not allow other nations to have that, so they opted for technological development. So we have F-16 and bombers and bombs, and even they provide the infrastructure for that, I might add. The result is we have this tension, that we have this body of investment in non-usable products, military weapons. In these last few years, we've seen some profound structural changes. Maybe the collapse of our banks made it more vivid, because the collapse of our banks could symbolize the end of an era, one that perhaps needs change and not resuscitation. I'm not convinced that you can put all this new wine in old wineskins and get the desired results. We've poured $10 trillion into the stimulus package. We're banking on watering the leaves. The hemorrhaging continues. Last month in the States, we lost 800,000 jobs, about 600,000 more homes in foreclosure. The student loan debt is $95 billion a year. and credit card debt even higher. Students, the government can borrow money as a creditor from the feds at 3%, and sell it to students at 8%. Our government is making money off of students, off of the principal and the interest and the default rate. It's helping to fund our government. The banks are getting 0% money and selling to students at 6 to 8%, so they're getting free money, charging a fee for the money. Students should get at least the same deal that banks get, and that becomes a tax cut and an investment, as well as expanding our economic options and market at the same time. And so we've seen this collapse of our banks, but there was a kind of moral, ethical collapse that preceded the banking collapse. It was the speculative greed of the energy industry, for which there was no adequate oversight, the banking collapse, and now a panic and stimulus, which may be more of a panic reaction than a long-term plan. And then the subprime lending schemes will lose about 4 million more homes to subprime lending in the next 2 or 3 years. And so it's kind of strange that we're pouring $10 trillion in the front door, but still losing jobs and losing students because of the student loan debt and losing our houses. And so the result is the collapse of our cities. And as these cities are facing collapse and cannot fund our schools, we end up with first-class jails and second-class schools. As a matter of fact, there are 2.3 million Americans in jail as we speak tonight, or prison. 1 million are African American. 500,000 are Latino. Largest jail industrial complex for profit in the world. So we have challenges beyond having an enlightened president. We've got our arms around the globalization of capital, basically benefiting the wealth as they search for cheaper labor markets. The result is, however, is that the globalization of our capital has diminished the middle class, diminished manufacturing, expanded the poor in America. So we've globalized capital, but not globalized human rights, workers' rights, children's rights, women's rights, and a care for our global environment. It's interesting that globalization can work when it is balanced and overseen. In Beijing at the Olympics this past August, you saw the globalization of athletics. Youth from all over the world were in competition in basketball and track and swimming and in various gymnastic activities. And at the end of it, there were winners and losers. Some got gold medals and some silver, some bronze, and some did not place. But all was happy. And there was no radical or reaction of any violent sort when the game was over. And why could we have in the globalized athletic event with such intense competition and outcome where in a real sense everybody was a winner? It was that way because the game started 0-0. The playing field was even. Rules were public. Goals were clear. And you had referees and umpires. No one saying that the game was too big to fail. Everybody had to play by one set of rules. And just we have globalization of our athletics with the balanced infrastructure, we do not have that in access to health care and education and jobs. One of the things that struck me so much about President Barack Obama's leadership in his reaching out to Cuba and reaching out to Venezuela, reaching out to Islam and to Haiti, in our own hemisphere, reaching out to Iran. That's what global leaders must do. bring our family under one big tent and stop the name calling of who is a rogue and who is honest, and let all of us forgive, redeem, and move on and build a new world order. One reason about 10 years ago, a young woman came to me, matter of fact, two students. One of them was Roxanne Saberi. She was a grad student at Northwestern University, and I gave her her first interview and signed a book. Little did I know, 10 years later, we would be trying to get her out of prison in Iran. Today, our delegation made the application for visas to go to Iran. I hope that they will allow us in and to meet with the appropriate religious and political leaders in Iran as we seek to gain her freedom. Iran is such a great civilization nation with so much to offer. Issues around its oil, its strategic position next door to Iraq, sitting atop the Persian Gulf. Iran has so much to offer that region and the world, and holding her as a kind of trophy does not serve the issue of Iran or the human family very much. So on the basis of mercy, a humanitarian plea, I do not speak as a government official, but a moral appeal. Please let Roxanne go free. Please let her go free. It's amazing oftentimes what small gestures can do to open up dialogue, whether it was the ping pong of the Chinese some years ago, opening up more dialogue with China. I remember we've been blessed to bring people home to Germany and France and Britain and America and Canada from Syria and Cuba and Iraq and Yugoslavia and Liberia. I remember once when we brought Goodman back from Syria, someone said, well, what did you do different than President Reagan? I said, I tried. And when we brought him to the White House, President Reagan was very gracious in receiving him. And he said, what can we do for you now? I said, call President Assad and say, thank you. He called him. He said, thank you. They talked, and they never stopped talking. Just a gesture of setting the captive free opened up more dialogue at that time between the U.S. And Syria. So we hope that as we seek to gain entry into Iran, our moral appeal of mercy will be heard. Leadership at its best must organize and put the pieces together. And when the athletes met in Beijing this summer, and they all had different flags and different color uniforms, but they had one set of rules. They had some principles. And our foreign policy cannot be foreign to our values. International law must not be preempted or marginalized because someone has power, as it happened with the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq. We must honor international law, human rights, self-determination, economic justice, shared security, and leadership that will risk for peace. Someone said earlier that if President Barack is not successful in reaching out to Iran, reaching out to Venezuela, or Cuba, or North Korea, diplomatically with success, what will happen? So what will happen is he will have tried, he will find some measure of success. When you reach out, you may lose. If you don't reach out, you're guaranteed to lose. You cannot lose reaching out and building bridges and removing walls. I suppose that's what happened. As I look at, and lastly, his victory this past year, many press people or others were caught off guard in the sense that his victory was a surprise. Really, it was more of a delight than surprise. It's been a 54-year process. It didn't come down unilaterally in this way. It was an evolution of struggle whose result was America becoming mature enough and secure enough to have a heated contest between a woman and African American. One could see in the race in Mississippi, where Serena Goodman and Cheney, two Jews and a black, were brutally killed. Meg Evers was killed trying to register people to vote. Emmett Till was lynched in that state, often so blooded by acts of terrorism. In that state, when you could see white men voting for Hillary, a woman, and whites voting for Barack at Jackson State University. The watch of Barack and McCain debate at Ole Miss where Meredith had to go with the help of the armed troops. One could see that Hillary and Barack had become conduits through which a transformation and redemption process was taking place. But it didn't just happen that way. It happened through at least 54 years of struggle. One might say 60 years, in the sense that when my father's generation came back from World War II, having faced tremendous humiliations in their struggle to make the world more secure, African American soldiers did not have the same rights on a military basis as Nazi POWs. Nazi POWs laughed at them because they had more access to the commissaries than did my father's generation of soldiers. And yet they did not give up, not that they betrayed the integrity of the principles of our country, but they determined to have a double V: victory against Nazism abroad and victory against racism at home. They fought both battles, and they are winning both battles. Deep, profound struggles as you fight Nazism, as you fight fascism, racism in its many forms, but they never stopped fighting. They convinced President Truman to sign the executive order for civil rights to integrate the military. That was 1948, 60 years ago. 6 years later, the 54th Supreme Court decision, ironically in President Barack's mother's home state, Kansas, where they ruled to make racial segregation and by extension gender segregation illegal. That law changed the course of America and perhaps the Western world in a most profound way. Because up until that time, based upon the 1896 decision, legal segregation by race was legal. We won that legal battle. We live in our faith, whatever our faith may be, we live under the law. The reason why in America we on the money we have e pluribus unum, of the minute we become one, whatever our faiths may be, we still must share common law, equal protection, equal opportunity, and equal access under the law. The law changed in 1954. 1955 was a one-year boycott led by Mrs. Parks and Dr. King, but that was a testing of the 54 law. While much emphasis has been put on the success of the boycott in 55, it was winning the legal case in 56 that further validated the 54 Supreme Court decision. And then 8 years of struggle, one of which was Little Rock 9 in 1957. Those students led to the school by the military were testing the 54 law. The citizens of the Sixers kept challenging local laws vis-a-vis the 54 decision. And so, by 1964, we outlawed segregation by race in public accommodations. It was not commonly known, as people look at Dr. King's speech referred to as the I Have a Dream speech, 1963. On the day he gave that speech, from Texas in the Southwest across to Florida, up to southern Maryland, blacks and Latinos could not use a single public toilet. Our money was counterfeited. you could not buy ice cream in the front door at Howard Johnson's, or rent a Holiday Inn hotel, or from Texas across to Florida up to Maryland. The day he gave that speech, black veterans of foreign wars did not have the right to vote. And the speech was not so much about the dream as it was about the broken promise. So I stand in Lincoln's majestic shadow. 1863, you promised. The promise has not been honored. Looking at the Congress, it said you promised in the 13th Amendment equal protection to abolish slavery, but it's not been honored. You promised. Matter of fact, we have a bounce check mark insufficient fund, a kind of metaphorical transition. Saying in the real sense that I refuse to believe America, with all of its power, cannot enforce its own laws, protect all of its citizens. And so I dream of a day when the promises will be honored. It really was about the broken promise. I have a dream as a kind of alliterative, poetic climax. But we kept marching. And then 1965, after many legal battles, there was this huge physical battle at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, about the right to vote. Lest we forget, that struggle was not about blacks voting only. White women couldn't serve on juries in Alabama at that time, and many states across the South. Farmers who couldn't pay poll taxes could not vote. It was driven by the black sense of urgency, but it was for all people. 1970, we argued that if our youth are old enough to fight a war in Vietnam, they should be old enough to vote. And out of that drive came 18-year-olds got the right to vote. We made the tent a little bigger. By 1974, the argument was made if you go to school in Iowa, you shouldn't have to vote absentee. You shouldn't have to go home to vote. You should be able to vote where you go to school. So we won the right of residency. So this year, students at Iowa, for example, could turn dormitories into precincts and vote en masse because of a 1974 legal victory. By 75, we got something called bilingual voting. You vote in the language, your first language. Whether it was speaking Spanish, Native American, German, or Russian, as the case may have been, that made the tent bigger. By 1984, when I first ran, you had to have a 45% threshold thereabout to qualify as a delegate, and winner take all. And we reduced that down to about 15%. We lowered the threshold as we were trying to democratize democracy and make it more available for all of the people. And then we finally won the victory over winner take all, in that we fought and won proportionality. Clearly, if you can have in Iraq proportionality for Shiites, students encouraged to avoid one group dominating it all. We understand proportionality. Even in South Africa, there's a constitutional place for whites so that one group does not have the constitutional right to overthrow or violate all the people. So on that same basic principle of proportionality, this year Hillary Clinton won barely Texas and California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. On the winner take all, she would have been the nominee. But by not democratizing democracy and proportionality, even as President Barack was losing barely, he was also winning by gaining more and more delegates. And ultimately, he won because we were able in 84 and 88 to help democratize the rules for everybody. I feel good tonight about the progress our nation has made and keenly aware of the unfinished business. In my lifetime, I've seen us on August 28th, 1955, Emmett Till was lynched. What a sad day it was. And I think perhaps it made it even more sad because it came just after the 54th Supreme Court decision. His mother was bold enough to bring his bullet-riddled, watermarked body back to Chicago and lay him out in an open casket. 100,000 people walked past his casket to see his body. And they never were the same again. She profoundly said, "This is what you did to my son. it started a great movement. I once asked Mrs. Parks, why didn't you go to the back of the bus? After all, you know you were breaking the law in Alabama. You know you were going to jail. You could have been hurt or injured. She said, I thought about Emmett Till. I couldn't go back. It had that profound emotional impact thrusting us forward. So August 28, 55, Emmett Till lynched. State-sanctioned terrorism. There was no rush to find those who did the killing. August 28, 1963, Dr. King speaking in Washington, dreaming beyond our predicament. August 28, 2008, President Barack Obama gets a nomination in Denver, Colorado. One sees America growing. And what made for the growth? The law change. The law changed, behavior began to change, and then attitudes, and then the culture. There is unfinished business, because while we're stimulating, reviving, resuscitating the banks, putting lots of new wine in old wineskins, the water has not gotten down to the roots, it's just at the leaves. The banks are getting more and more, and yet they have not yet made a commitment to, in fact, invest where there are great areas of darkness and pain. I'm convinced we need a series of smaller, manageable, accountable banks, not more and more to fewer and fewer. Why do we need 2 or 3 global banks that are beyond oversight and in fact have shown an unwillingness to in fact invest in people in a very fundamental sense? Well, the good news is that as we continue to grow, we know that we can bounce back from where we are tonight. I'm concerned on one extreme you have the African Americans #1 in tennis and golf and track and now presidential politics. On the other hand, we're #1 in infant mortality, #1 in short life expectancy, #1 in unemployment, #1 in targeted foreclosure of homes, #1 in access to capital, industry, and technology, #1 victims of the criminal justice system. And so we now have freedom, but there's profound areas of structural inequality. And those are not natural gaps, those are social gaps that require social investment. So tonight we celebrate the progress we made, and we commit ourselves to close those gaps, to create an even playing field and make America a better place, a more just place for all of its people. I'm glad to be in this region of the world again, to see the growth of industries and technology in this area, because the adjustment we must all make now. I went to a BMW plant the other day, and those workers make $500 a month, one of the best cars on earth, about $6,000 a year, and with that efficiency, and they're making cars that sell at $400,000. Wages down, profit up, and there are no Buicks, Cadillacs, Hummers, and SUVs on the roads in that country next door. As they develop that sense of outgrowth, globalization of car making around the world, our industries can hardly compete. Every time a GM rolls off the assembly line, it's minus $1,500 for health care, plus retirement and plus pensions. And so the global restructuring of economies must now be dealt with in a very different way. The stimulus will only work if we take into account not just banks, but globalization of workers and of resources, and have for all people bottom up access to health care and jobs and education. We all deserve that. It can and must happen. Thank you very much.
Can I take questions here or from the seat over there? It's entirely up to you, wherever you'd be most comfortable.
Here.
Here's good. Okay. There we go. Let's see if that one works. There's a reversal of roles here, which is, but at least I'm a little bit lower than Reverend Jackson, which seems appropriate. There's a microphone at the back there, which Kunrung is managing now. Anybody who'd like to put questions to the Reverend Jackson, please come forward, speak clearly, keep your questions reasonably brief if you can. There's a lot of people who want to speak, and to the point of today's talk. First question, please. And could you also introduce yourself as well?
Okay, hello. My name is Lola Rainey, and I'm from Arizona, and I wanted to say thank you, Reverend Jackson, for coming to Arizona so many years ago to help us get the official celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday, which the folks in Arizona originally voted down. And it was thanks to people like you who came out to remind Arizonans that Dr. Martin Luther King was not just a black hero, he was an American hero. And ultimately, we did get that holiday, so thank you for that. But my question is this. Now, what kind of moral response do people conscious should they have when it comes to government policy that sort of breeds the conditions that we're dealing with in Darfur, or even dealing with the banking system, with the lack of regulation of global banks? What kind of response do you have? Because it seems like it's such an overwhelming situation that you're left with feeling despair and helplessness. So how do you take action and have hope that you can make a difference?
I would urge us to take a look in a nutshell at what drove the banking collapse in America and has affected the world. First of all, if I can envision for you a five-legged stool, the banks had concentrated power and used their powers to maximize profit, and with no small amount of corruption and exploitation, the banks fought to be unaccountable. They fought to be unregulated. They got what they wanted, and now they don't want what they got. And they said, in effect, that we can self-govern ourselves. We don't need to be overseen. Can you imagine a world soccer match that said we do not need referees and umpires because the players can govern themselves with the help of their fans? The referees and umpires saved the players from themselves. And so we had the banking leg out here without accountability, without fair and reasonable regulations. And the Congress, the second leg, was supposed to do the overseeing, but it was either trying to raise funds on Wall Street or get a job on Wall Street. It lost the strength and moral authority to oversee the banks. And so if Liverpool plays Chelsea and the referees work for one team or the other, you could not trust them on close calls. So if Congress was in fact sucked into the Wall Street machine, it lost the capacity to do oversight. I question now whether or not they even have the capacity to do it in the first place. I'm not sure that a local governing board can oversee a global bank that plays nations off against nations. You have to have some kind of global referee umpire structure for a global bank. Do we need such an institution in the first place? And so the banks were left without regulation. The Congress did not oversee. And thirdly, did not enforce fair lending laws. And that's what put the people in this home foreclosure crisis to begin to sink the marketplace. The fourth leg was the FBI's role was to do fraud investigation. Under President Bush, thank you very much. Under President Bush, there were like 3,000 FBI's whose job it was to detect fraud. Well, he removed them from that and put all of them on reacting to 9/11. So he removed the fraud squad from their post. We had signs 4 years ago that fraud, like Madoff, was abounding, but the FBI was not there, along with SEC, to do that. And the fifth leg was globalization. They simply, even when they brought the bankers to Washington about 5 weeks ago, I was sat in that hearing, they raised questions like, did you fly down here, did you drive, what's your pay, what's your bonus, how you handling your business now. There's not one question about globalization. How can you have a serious banking meeting and not discuss the impact of globalizing capital without globalizing rules and regulation and workers and women and children? Adult labor can't compete with child labor. Women shouldn't have to work and do the same job and make less money than men. You cannot have a society where you in fact have these gigantic skyscrapers touching the sky, and then just beneath people don't have drinkable water or health care, where the social contract is broken and where there is no commitment to in fact lift up the base. One thing I questioned even while in Malaysia was, one thing that Ford said, Henry Ford, was that he wanted his workers to be able to buy the cars that they make. If in fact you are making the best cars in the world and cannot afford to buy one of them, there's something missing in that equation. We must keep fighting to build societies bottom up and not just top down. Thank you.
Next question, please.
Yes, Adam Rosenblatt, Australian freelance journalist. I'll introduce a little humour. I've been terribly pessimistic about the United States for a long time, and I let my green card expire. But since I've listened to you talk, I might reintroduce myself to the United States, perhaps. But you have the moniker Reverend, Jesse Jackson.
You have to get in line.
And I want to ask you a typical biblical question. Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus were around a long time, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000 years ago. Why come it's taking so damn long for things to change? That's my question. Thank you.
Next. You know, a lot has changed, and one might argue that the last 50 years have seen the most change. We're about to change, it seems, from the dollar, because we're so in debt to China. That's a change that's imminent unless something changes rather quickly. Or in the last 50 years, we've seen from Ghana down to South Africa, the decolonization of Africa. We've seen the decolonization of Asia in the last 50 years. Problem is that we have midday in our politics, but midnight in our economies. We've not addressed the lagging inequality gaps that came out of colonialism. And now as the very rich get much richer quicker with technological speed and infrastructure, middle class sinking and the poor base expanding, that gap is driving pain and sometimes terrorism. We must work feverishly to close that gap, because the more people can have a way of life that's fair and just, the more they can protect their interests. But right now, this gap between those in the surplus culture and those in the deficit culture must change. Again, I would hope that you who are listening, who may have some allies or voice into Iran, just as human beings, as people who care, reach out to that nation to free Roxana, to let her go. We need not argue about the politics of the matter, just humanitarian matter. Free her and allow a window of dialogue to occur. You can get on with the broader agenda between Iran, the U.S., and other nations. Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is a bit more serious. Dan Tenkate from Bloomberg News. You've mentioned on the one hand reaching out to rogue regimes such as Cuba, Iran. On the other hand, ensuring that globalization can work for the poor, for workers, for women. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on how that would translate into actual policy issues that the Obama administration is struggling with right now, particularly in regards to sanctions or trade deals. To use an example, in Asia, you have China, you have Burma. The Bush administration had a policy to deal with China, and their logic was that if we deal with China economically, we'll have more leverage with them on human rights abuses. With Burma, it was more like we're going to put a lot of sanctions on this regime to deal with the human rights abuses there. The Obama administration is reconsidering its policies towards these countries like Cuba and Burma as well. Where do you come down on that? And even with the free trade agreements, I mean, should we be promoting economic development in these countries so a middle class can grow and human rights can develop that way? Or should we be demanding, labor standards in these trade agreements? So on these policy issues, where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, how do you think these should be dealt with?
If at the Athletic Olympics, it's a 100-meter race, if some people have to run 110 yards, 110 meters, and some have to run 60, it will never work. You have to have one set of rules. And you have to have some commitment, shared commitment to international law. It becomes a basis, it seems, for defining what people are. I repeat, adult labor can't compete with child labor, and none can compete with slave labor, and those are very serious issues. How a nation treats women, how it addresses the issue of drinkable water. These issues are real, and so it means that we must think in terms of free trade and fair trade. I'm very concerned about tariffs that make it too high to have reciprocal and mutually beneficial trade. And we cannot just settle for less standards for China because it's big and strong. Because if you relax those standards for China, then what do you say to Cuba? If you relax those standards for Burma, then what do you say to North Korea? So we run the risk of gaining the world and losing our soul or losing our moral authority. It may not be as quick as we want it to be, but we cannot give any indication that human rights can be excused because of the expediency of some kind of money deal. We just owe it to ourselves to maintain a high standard.
So just a quick follow-up. So for sanctions on Burma, for instance, would you recommend to the Obama administration that they keep them in place or that they remove them?
Well, whatever is required to incentivize them to honor international law. I don't want to deal, frankly, tonight in the particulars of a given situation where there are these violations, whether it is Burma or Sri Lanka, wherever it may be found fighting for a just solution. And when I hear sometimes that there are those who want to excuse human rights for expediency, I know that that is full of moral perils. There was some time back when President Reagan would say, we know South African apartheid is bad, but that's local. And South Africa's given the Cape of Good Hope in the Atlantic Oceans come together and kiss. We can't run the risk of losing that trade route, mess around with an internal problem called apartheid. So let's have constructive engagement with apartheid. We had to end it, not engage in. We had to end it. And that passage is as safe today as it ever was. And so we have numerous examples of the price we pay when we excuse tyranny for expediency. Reason we came into World War II so late and so slow. We know Hitler's a tyrant, and we know he's doing some things unseen, but at least he's our ally, and he does not believe in communism. Mobutu in Zaire at that time, we know he's a tyrant, but he's our tyrant. He's our kind of guy. And so we've had our fill of people of policies that excuse tyrants because of expediency. It's not a good sign.
Next question, please.
My name is Stuart Ward. I'm, amongst other things, chairman of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign here in Thailand. And it's been a pleasure to be listening and to be in the same room as someone that I have admired during the years and who has been a beacon in an American darkness on many, many occasions. The theme of the evening is peace and conflict, the resolution of conflict. You mentioned concepts like the importance of international law being in place, about civil rights, human rights, self-determination, economic justice. My question to you is, what will you do to make all those things come true for the Palestinians who've been waiting for that for 60 years? And when are we going to see the end of the Israel lobby determining American policy in that part of the world?
Usually because that is such a sticky issue, presidents wait till the last year of their 8-year term. President Barack is putting in the first 100 days of his term. And George Mitchell has been assigned to begin to deal with that now, not later on. And I would hope that he would know that no matter who the envoy is, the formula will not work. I believe in a two-state solution. It's mutual security. It's mutually beneficial. We would get beyond finger pointing and name calling and get down to the bargaining chips, and that is to say that Israel deserves security and its right to exist, and Palestinians deserve the same thing. And you're not going to have two nations living side by side, but one side of the river is parched and the other one is green. There must be a real commitment to lift up so that can have a shared existence. And I would hope that George Mitchell's presence there would be advocating a formula that is mutual. There have been some who want to back away from the two-state solution. And President Barack Obama, in just yesterday's press, insists upon a two-state solution. That's a step in the right direction. When I raised this issue 25 years ago about two states, I was almost driven off the side of the road because at that time we had a no-talk policy, some of the genius of Kissinger. We know that no talk made no sense, got no progress. And I really feel that if George Bush from Odessa, Texas had picked up where Clinton left off, Clinton had us very close to a deal, and it must have been 2000. It was just dropped, for 7 years. And so engagement works in ways that disengagement does not work, and we can only hope and pray for George Mitchell's success. I think he is keenly aware that any formula must be two-state, and it must be fair, and it must be consistent, and we support that proposition.
Next question, please.
Ande, I'm a publisher here. I asked, actually, the question I wanted to ask was the same than this. I asked you 6 years ago, I asked you this question, but it wasn't answered. You talk about negotiation, and you talk about morality also. America finances all the atrocities in the Middle East. If America would stop paying, there would be a settlement very soon. Why always talking? That is window dressing. If America wouldn't finance it, finish. There's a solution overnight.
You should talk to people doing the paying. That's not me. I'm not paying for it. But I am concerned that how we handle leveraging and responsibility. Some of my allies wanted to bring the Dalai Lama to Southeast Asia, but no nation would accept him because China objects. That's dangerous. The contradiction last month, the Dalai Lama couldn't get into South Africa when Mandela and Bishop Tutu were saying, let him in. China leveraging in South Africa. We cannot allow those who have the power to act as if might is right when right is might. And whether it's a short-term or long-term battle, we must keep fighting to uphold the right principles. And again, in the case in Israel and Palestine. I hope George Mitchell's success and whatever I can do, because I'm sensitive to the pain and fears on both sides. Both are gripped by fear. It's like if two people were in a fight and they were stabbing each other in the back, and you can choose side A or side B, but what you really want to choose is stop stabbing, not choose who's going to do the most stabbing and who has the most power to do the stabbing. The U.S. must be an honest broker to do for both of them what neither can do for the other. Pull them apart. And so far, either lack of brokering or lack of honest brokering have left both of them in the predicament of killing each other. I hope that we will have learned our lesson, and I would think that President Obama certainly understands it. Remains to be seen as to how he will handle this a bit early, I think, to be conclusive.
How can anybody be an honest broker if he finances one side? I compared this policy like the old American policy: take the land from the Indians, and if they rebel, kill them. That is not the way to create peace and understanding and healing the wounds.
Well, if you have you may put a square peg in a round hole, but you'll have corns on your feet. It just won't work. I mean, the policy has to be consistent, or it will not work. No matter how hard we try, you can't put a size 10 foot in a size 8 shoe. It just won't work. And no matter who is trying, it still won't work. And I would hope this time around that, kicking it off early on, that the people come to their senses, because what we have done isn't working because it's inconsistent. Next
question, please.
Hi, Reverend. My name is Aaron, and I'm from the Bronx. It struck me while you spoke that indeed you were involved or in some way responsible for a lot of the sort of watershed moments in racial history in the United States in the last 60 or beyond that years. And certainly with the election of President Obama, and largely elected on the moniker of hope and change, that the election of a non-white man to the office is definitely a very positive step for the United States. And yet you also referenced that there are 1 million or more African American men in jail, and you're more likely to go to jail in the United States if you're a black man than you are to graduate from high school. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of how we have this leader now who indeed is riding the wings of hope and change, and yet our education systems are failing, and race indeed remains a very sort of crucial issue for the lives of most Americans.
Well, ultimately, we must change direction, not just complexion. Our change in complexion says we're becoming more secure on the question of race and question of gender. But, for example, on the stimulus plan, if we're just bailing out banks and don't take into account globalization of manufacturing, it cannot succeed no matter who provides the stimulus, because if there's not a manufacturing stimulus, if there's not some plan to stop home foreclosures and some plan to stop student loan exploitation, you simply cannot win. And I would think that on the criminal justice system, when plants close, jobs leave, and drugs and jails are coming in a phenomenal way. You know, Chicago in the last 16 months, 600 kids have been shot or killed, teenagers. And those are Baghdad numbers. In America, we lose 30,000 a year to gun violence. We've lost 4,500 U.S. soldiers in Iraq in about 6 years, and 30,000 a year at home are killed with gun violence, and 100,000 are injured who do not die. Because you can buy off of the street corner, literally in gun shows, AK-47 Uzis and M16s. I mean, you cannot reconcile a more civil, peaceful society making those kind of guns accessible. There is an interesting observation Senator Clinton made last week. Along the U.S. border with Mexico, 7,500 Mexicans were killed in the last year. But you can't really jump on Mexico because they're supplying the drugs, we're supplying the appetite and the guns. You're getting the guns from us and the money from us, and we're getting the drugs from them. So we're somewhat complicit in the drug situation. So I mean, these are very tough issues, and you certainly cannot fight for a culture of peace if you remain the largest consumer of drugs and make the most guns accessible. I am very disturbed about the fact that our violence account in our own cities is greater than that in these so-called foreign war zones. And the other part about that is that as we fight to make that better, is that we kind of got to decide as a people to end violence as a solution to solving problems. Got to kill the idea that killing is a solution. We must not any longer see violence as strength and non-violence as weakness. Non-violence it takes more strength to think than to shoot. It takes more strength to negotiate than to confront. We're going to change our very outlook on how you resolve conflict. That means some commitment to real justice. And when I look, for example, in our policies in this region of the world, I'm afraid unless we deal with this trade imbalance issue, with people panicking, to turn themselves to get nationalistic and start getting mean. We need meaningful policy, not mean policy. Unless we work out this trade gap, you could see some ugly results. And I'm very anxious about that.
Patrick Wynn from Global Post. Reverend, back home in the States, open racism is thankfully very taboo. But I think any of us that have spent a little time in Asia, from a Western perspective, are sometimes a little shocked at the nonchalance with which discrimination against people with darker skin is out there. Sometimes a little surprising from an American perspective. With China and Asia on the whole as a rising center of power, does this concern you?
I missed your point. I apologize.
No problem. I think some people in the room agree with me that sometimes discrimination against people with darker skin in Asia is a little, from a Western perspective, shockingly nonchalant and okay with a lot of people. And I really hate to generalize, but it's an observation I've made.
Well, it shouldn't be, and that's why the UN Conference on Racism should have been successful and not scuttled last week. Because wherever racism or religious-ism or gender bias express themselves, they're always hurtful to people who are on the short end of that stick. And so one of the things that's going to happen more and more in Asian countries and now European countries that used to be all European. Now, I was in the Netherlands about a month ago, and the black and brown population there is moving up into the 30s. They're having to come to grips with a multiracial society. In Malaysia, the Indian and China factor there is rising to very different levels. And so people who've had kind of one race societies, as the world moves now more freely through immigration policies, and as the poor move toward greener grass, it would be for the future how to handle immigration policy. And people of different colors and languages become the next phase of it. Because while you got you got this new technological development, our sense of moral consciousness is not keeping up with our technology. We're out in outer space with our iPods and the like, but our sense of social justice contract is lagging behind. So wherever, and I must say in Holland at least, I saw vigorous efforts by people to form anti-racism groups, and as they try to figure out to learn to live together. Because as we were fighting to end apartheid, one of the big factors was the Dutch. The Dutch Reformed Church was a big backer of that system there, but they are actively working to try to bring down the barriers. I saw a play with people from from gay, straight to black, white, brown, all working on it. There'll never be a day when it's over, but we should not stop working on it. When you mention the darker skin issue here, people kind of applauded, bring it out. Well, you who are journalists, if you look in your newsroom and you do not have a multiracial newsroom, it starts with you, not just them. The newsroom should look like the people it's covering too. And so often we have newsrooms where, in fact, journalists become colonizers because they tell what they see from their point of view, which may be a view that does not reflect the nuances of the people that they're covering.
We've got time for just one more question, please. This is the last one.
Always last but never least.
Oh boy.
Reverend Jackson, let me start off by saying thank you for all you've done, not only in America, but all over the world to help bring people together. I know of my own personal knowledge of some of the many things you've done, didn't get paid for it. He and I go back 30 years. He doesn't remember me, but that's okay. We go back 30 years.
Since I was a kid.
All right. And I was just a little bit older.
Oh boy.
Bottom line, I have a question that I hope you can answer that will help us, those of us who are journalists in this room, become better journalists and better balanced journalists. It gives me great concern that oftentimes we are self-censored and that we participate in our self-censorship, and oftentimes we create journalistic censorship. You anticipated part of my question by dealing with the UN conference last week against racism, and I would use that as an example since you brought it up. On the BBC as well as the CNN, so there's no discrimination via countries and major news outlets, there was a situation, as you recall, when Ahmadinejad was making his speech, and there were some approximately 30 people who got up and walked out. At that same time, approximately 200 other people remained seated and were applauding what Ahmadinejad said. I never heard what he said because they wouldn't play the English translation during that segment for us to hear. Self-censorship. In addition to that, they continued to play over and over for 24 hours, just that short segment of the 30 people walking out, and never showed the 200 people sitting down and applauding. Now that's journalism at its worst, because people will continue to see the people walking out and probably conclude they were right. I have no issue as to whether they were right or not. My issue is the censorship that appeared throughout the world, that the people who walked out, they must be right. We see it 100 times. And the people who remained, well, they must be wrong because they tried to cut that segment out. Can you help us and give us some direction?
No.
Please try.
Sure. First of all, that conference should have been successful, but it was doomed to fail, in part because some people were determined to put forth a resolution at the beginning that undermined dialogue. You cannot have a successful conference that's sensitive with a prepackaged plan with a conclusion before you start. So I thought that the very idea of putting forth a sensitive, politically weighted resolution was a guarantee to undercut it. Also, if you're going to deal with something as sensitive as racism, there is no future name calling. You've got to figure out how to get beneath labeling and name calling to get with the substance of matters. And some people at these conferences cannot contain putting forth their own politic and not trying to work out the problems. And I regret that in Durban it was almost the same thing. And you had, of course, last week, the conference was doomed to fail because you had people coming to it with a closed agenda and not an open mind. Where I thought you was going in part was while there is a focus on the Gaza killings and the problem that went along with the Gaza, about 1,100 people were killed. About 4,000 in Zimbabwe have died from cholera alone. It's as if it were not people. While there is great tension in the Middle East, which we must obviously address, about 8 million have been killed between the Congo and Sudan the last 8 years. 8 million, and they are people too. But in our own hemisphere, while we espouse human rights as a great principle, if you come across from Haiti, where they're eating mud pie as a staple crop, you're locked up and sent back. You come from Cuba, you are embraced and given a subsidy. You cannot have one policy for Haitians who are fleeing and one for Cubans saying, well, the Cubans are fleeing political persecution, Haitians are fleeing economic persecution. That's just insulting to an intelligent mind to figure out a way to let one in and let the other one out. I mean, to me, that the censorship goes to what's important to a journalist. These contradictions between Cuba and Haiti next door are just too big to ignore. So far, we seem to be dismissive of the crisis in Africa unless they come up as pirates on the coast someplace. And I don't support piracy. On the other hand, there must be a story behind that story that deserves a broader telling. As I mean, what's triggering the pirates beside the pirate? I mean, the pirates, are they born someplace? They drop out the sky? What's driving? And there's too little coverage of what's driving that dynamic. And why is it happening here and not happening there? And so I think the censorship sometimes can go to what you refuse to cover. I observe Black home that the media often projects blacks in 5 deadly ways. It's less intelligent than we are, less hardworking, less universal, less patriotic, and more violent. Some of that may be changing now, the extent to which President Barack Obama won the election. But then there are others who would say because he won the election, you no longer need affirmative action. There are now 9 Supreme Court cases on civil rights in this session, the most ever, where there's an attempt to unravel the infrastructure, the movement that made him possible. What made his victory possible was a civil rights movement with enforceable, funded laws. And there's an attempt to unravel those laws. And of course, if you have Thomas Jefferson, if you have Frederick Douglass as president, and take away the 13th Amendment, you still don't have much. You follow what I'm saying? So to me, the self-censorship is also what, because people can cover what are their cultural, what's culturally important to them. I close on this one. When President Clinton went to Africa around 1998, went to Ghana, maybe 500,000 people came. On that trip were mostly white senior journalists who had never been to Africa before, and that was one of those trips where you can kind of go based upon who got seniority and can leverage their way onto the plane. And so we got there 500,000 to 600,000 people. President Clinton got through speaking. He went down and worked the ropes as he tended to do with the Secret Service having fits. So he was working the rope. They started rushing the fence. They were crushing some children, and he was saying, get back, you're crushing children. And all of the news tonight was Clinton fights with Africans, in battle with Ghanaians. I mean, they just abused the truth of what happened. And I asked one of the major journalists, had something to do with Africa, and he said, well, frankly, I believe what you're saying, Reverend, but I've never been to Africa, so I can't cover what I don't know. Well, how could you be a journalist with the highest stature and admit almost as if you were almost bragging, but I don't cover Africa and Asia because I'm not into that. You cannot be if we're going to globalize capital, globalize journalism too. Globalize appreciation of peoples and their nuances. And I would hope in years to come that we would see multiracial newsrooms as necessary in our pursuit of truth. I want to introduce two people with us on this journey who represent the best of American journalism. One who used to write for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, now does writing, among other things, for the National Negro Publishers Association. George Curry. George, please stand. And another former writer with New York Times and LA Times and Chicago Tribune, who is gone by way of those newspapers, a columnist nonetheless, Don Terry. Don, stand. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For any of you who want a DVD of tonight's presentation by the Reverend Jackson, you can send an email to info@fcci.com, and we do have DVDs available, but you do need to send an email to that address, info@fcci.com, and DVDs are available. Thanks. Those we negotiate later.